We have all heard the old adage about a house being a sanctuary, a place where the walls are meant to hold nothing but warmth and the promise of a peaceful life. But sometimes those walls hold on to memories that were never meant to be inherited. Before we pull back the curtain on these three accounts, if you enjoy the feeling of the hair standing up on the back of your neck, consider hitting the subscribe button and joining us here on Nightfall Tales for our nightly descent into the unexplained. Elias Thorne was a man who believed in the tangible, concrete reality of the world, a skeptic through and through who viewed the purchase of a Victorian-era fixer-upper in rural Vermont as nothing more than a sound financial investment. He was a man of logic, a retired engineer who spent his days measuring dimensions and drafting blueprints, but his world began to tilt on its axis the moment he crossed the threshold of the Blackwood estate. The house sat on a hill that seemed to reject the sunlight, its exterior adorned with rotting cedar shingles that mimicked the jagged teeth of a closing trap. Elias moved in during the late autumn, the air already biting with the promise of a harsh winter, and he felt a lingering dampness in the foyer that a furnace could never quite reach. He spent the first week stripping away layers of floral wallpaper that had been applied decades prior, revealing behind them not just lath and plaster, but symbols etched directly into the support beams. They were intricate, swirling patterns that looked like frantic cursive written by someone who had forgotten how to breathe. And as he traced the grooves with his calloused thumb, he felt a sudden, sharp drop in the temperature that made his breath bloom in the air like smoke. He dismissed it as a draft, just as he dismissed the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards in the attic above his bedroom at 3 in the morning. Elias was a man who required proof, but the proof was accumulating in ways that defied his engineering mind. He began to find his measuring tapes moved from the workbench to the kitchen counter, and his pencil sketches of the floor plan would return to him in the morning with lines erased and new, impossible corridors drawn in red ink. He decided to set up a camera in the hallway, an infrared device designed to capture the nocturnal habits of wildlife, thinking he would finally prove that the house was settling in a way that mimicked movement. Instead, he watched, his face ashen in the glow of his monitor, as the kitchen door slowly swung open, a handle turning with a deliberate metallic click, even though he had installed a deadbolt the day before. Nothing walked through the frame, but the dust motes in the air began to swirl as if caught in a vortex, forming the distinct, elongated shape of a human that pressed itself against the lens until the screen flickered into static. Elias did not leave that night, held captive by a strange magnetic pull that kept him anchored to the armchair in the living room, watching the walls breathe. The house was not haunted in the way ghost stories suggested, with wailing spirits or rattling chains, but rather it seemed hungry, slowly absorbing the identity of the man living within it. He began to lose track of time, his internal clock failing him until he no longer knew if he had stood up to get water 5 minutes ago or 5 hours ago. The symbols he had found earlier began to appear on his own skin, thin, red welts that mimicked the carvings on the beams, and he found his own voice speaking words he did not understand, a low, guttural cadence that felt like it was rising from beneath the floorboards rather than from his throat. Elias Thorne became a phantom in his own life, a man who had traded his skepticism for a terrifying, singular knowledge of what lay between the atoms of his reality. He realized too late that the house was not an inheritance of property, but an inheritance of a burden that had been passed down through generations, waiting for a resident who possessed the structural understanding to maintain its integrity. He never left the Blackwood estate, not because he was physically unable, but because the house had become his architecture, and he had become its foundation. You might wonder if there is an escape from such a fate, but the truth is often more unsettling than the fiction we construct to keep the dark at bay. The second account follows Sarah Jenkins, a young woman who moved into a modern, minimalist home in Oregon, seeking a fresh start after a difficult year. The house was a marvel of glass and steel, an architectural triumph that promised a life of clarity and light. a complete antithesis to the history-laden structures that usually draw the curious. Sarah wanted nothing more than to wake up in a place that held no history, a clean slate where she could finally breathe. But she quickly discovered that the emptiness of a new home is not always a void. It is a vacuum, and vacuums have a way of pulling things in. During her third night, Sarah woke to the sound of a rhythmic tapping against the glass wall of her bedroom. A delicate, insistent sound like long, thin fingers testing the strength of the security glass. She pulled the curtains back, expecting to see a branch caught in the wind, but the trees were perfectly still in the moonlight. Below her, in the courtyard, she saw a figure standing by the reflecting pool, a tall, spindly silhouette that seemed to lack solid form, its limbs elongated and twitching in a way that made her stomach churn. Sarah did not scream. She was paralyzed by a cold, clinical curiosity. The figure did not move toward the door, nor did it attempt to break in, but it simply stood there, staring upward with eyes that reflected the moonlight like polished obsidian. Over the next few weeks, the house began to change, not in its physical appearance, but in the way it felt to inhabit it. The glass panels began to frost over from the inside, even when the heat was set to 70 degrees, and the air began to smell faintly of ozone and wet earth. Sarah started finding small, wet footprints leading from the glass walls toward her bed, disappearing halfway across the rug as if the entity were becoming exhausted or fading away. She tried to move, to pack her boxes and flee, but she found that the key to her front door would no longer turn in the lock, and the smart home system that controlled her lights and climate would reset itself every time she tried to override the settings. It was as if the house itself had become the entity's skin, a shell designed to capture her for its own purposes. She began to see the figure in the reflection of the glass, always just a step behind her, its face a smooth, featureless oval that mimicked her own movements with chilling precision. She realized that the glass was not a barrier, but a conduit, and the more she looked into the mirrors and windows to confirm what she was seeing, the more she was allowing the entity to map her features, her expressions, and perhaps even her soul. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah stood before the large window in the living room, watching the figure mimic her pose, its hands pressed against the glass from the outside, just as hers were pressed against it from the inside. She watched in horror as the glass began to ripple like water, her own hands sinking into the surface as if it were a viscous, freezing liquid. She felt a grip on her wrists, not of ice, but of a firm, synthetic pressure, and as she was pulled forward, she realized that the house was not haunted by a ghost, but by an echo of something that had never been human at all. She was not taken, but replaced, her consciousness shoved into the glass as the entity stepped into her life, wearing her skin like a tailored suit. The woman who walked out of the house the following morning looked exactly like Sarah, but to anyone who knew the real Sarah, the smile was just a fraction too wide, and the eyes were completely devoid of the light that had once made her who she was. You might tell yourself that home is where the heart is, but what happens when the heart is replaced by a rhythm that belongs to something else entirely? We try to secure our homes with deadbolts and perimeter alarms, yet we often forget that the most dangerous intruders are those that do not need to pry the door open to find a way inside. The third and final account is perhaps the most unsettling of all, for it concerns the Miller family, who moved into a sprawling ranch-style house in the heart of Texas, a place they hoped would be a sanctuary for their young daughter, Chloe. David and Alina Miller were pragmatic people, the kind who believed that any shadow could be banished with a bright enough light, but they soon found that some shadows exist regardless of the illumination. The house had been vacant for years, and the neighbors whispered that the previous owners had simply vanished one Tuesday afternoon, leaving their dinner cooling on the table and their cars in the driveway. The Millers paid no mind to the gossip, convinced that they were bringing life back into a dormant space. But the house seemed to resist their presence from the very first box they unpacked. Chloe, only 6 years old, was the first to notice the visitor. She would sit in her playroom for hours, talking to an empty corner, her laughter echoing through the hallway in a way that made Elena's skin prickle. When asked who she was playing with, Chloe would simply point to the wall and say that the man wanted to show her his toy box. David, ever the protector, chalked it up to an overactive imagination, but his attitude shifted when he found himself waking up at the same hour every night to the sound of a music box playing, even though there was no such item in their home. The music was discordant, a frantic, high-pitched tinkling that seemed to come from inside the drywall. He cut a hole in the plaster to inspect the wiring, but instead of copper and insulation, he found a collection of rusted keys, small, calcified teeth, and a tattered photograph of a family that looked remarkably like his own, though they were dressed in clothing from the early 1920s. The air in the room felt thick, almost gelatinous, and as David reached for the photograph, he heard a voice whisper his name from the dark, narrow space behind the wall. It was not a demonic growl or a ghostly moan, but a calm, conversational tone that sounded exactly like his own voice, distorted by the passage of time. The house began to manifest its history in fragments, with the Millers finding dishes from a century ago in their cupboards and old yellowed newspapers from the 20s appearing on their doorstep every morning. They were living in a temporal overlap, a place where the past was not just remembered, but actively bleeding into the present. Elena began to see the family from the photograph wandering the halls, not as translucent spirits, but as solid, grieving figures who looked at her with pity. They weren't trying to haunt the Millers. They were trying to warn them. The man in the photograph, who bore David's face, would stand by Chloe's bed every night, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, as if to shield her from something that lived in the ventilation system. The Millers realized that the house was a cycle, a recurring trap that pulled families in to replace those who had come before. A feeding process that kept the structure standing while the inhabitants withered away. They tried to leave, piling into their car in the middle of the night, but every road they took led them back to the end of their own driveway. The house was not merely a location. It was a destination, a point of no return that had been etched into the very soil beneath their feet. They are still there, living in the space between the seconds, their lives playing out in a loop that the neighborhood sees as an empty, abandoned property. They are a part of the walls now, their voices joining the discordant music that plays in the middle of the night, warning anyone who dares to trespass that some homes are never truly empty and some doors should never be unlocked. The feeling of being watched is not a trick of the mind. It is a primal instinct, a relic of a time when we knew that the shadows held more than just the absence of light. You might walk through your own home tonight, feeling the comforting weight of your possessions and the silence of your hallways. But consider for a moment what the house might be remembering while you sleep. Does it know the stories of those who walked its floors long before you arrived? Does it anticipate your movements, or does it merely tolerate your presence until the cycle begins again? Many people believe that horror is found in ancient castles or abandoned asylums, but the most profound terrors are the ones that take root in the mundane. A new home is a promise of a future, but it is also a legacy of everything that has occurred within its boundaries. We curate our lives with furniture and light, hoping to mask the underlying structure of a house that has seen birth, death, and everything in between. Perhaps the reason we feel uneasy in a new space is not because it is haunted in the traditional sense, but because we are invading a territory that has already established its own rules of existence. The boundary between our world and the unseen is thinner than we admit, and sometimes all it takes to cross that threshold is the simple act of moving in and hanging your keys on a hook. Think about the sounds in your own home tonight, the subtle settling of timber, the hum of the appliances, and the shift of the wind against the siding. Are those sounds truly natural? Or are they the breathing of a structure that has learned how to mimic the life within it? We are merely tenants of a reality that we do not fully comprehend, and the houses we dwell in are the gateways to truths we might be better off never uncovering. As you turn off the lights and prepare for the night, remember that the walls have ears and the hallways have long, lingering memories. If you have ever experienced something in your own home that felt just a little bit wrong, something that you couldn't quite explain away with logic or science, you are not alone. These stories are not just tales meant to frighten, they are warnings left by those who came before. The next time you walk through a doorway, take a moment to pause. Listen to the silence. Feel the temperature of the air as it brushes against your skin. You might find that you are not as alone as you think. If you found these stories unsettling, if they made you look at your own home with a new, sharper sense of awareness, then you understand the mission we have here on Nightfall Tales. We are dedicated to exploring the dark corners of the human experience, and your participation is what keeps the lights flickering in the basement. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, do not leave us in the dark. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below sharing your own experiences with homes that felt, for lack of a better word, wrong. We want to hear your stories, the ones that keep you awake at night and make you doubt the solid ground beneath your feet. Share this video with someone who thinks they are safe, and join us for our next transmission as we continue to peel back the layers of a reality that is far more fractured than it appears. The keys are in the lock, the door is slightly ajar, and the night is only just beginning. Stay vigilant, keep your eyes open, and remember that when you close your eyes tonight, the house will still be awake, watching, waiting, and remembering everything that has ever been lost within its walls. There is no such thing as a truly fresh start, for every home is built upon the ghost of a previous one, and the foundation is always hungry. We will be here, lurking in the static, waiting for you to return to the shadows of Nightfall Tales. Until then, keep the lights on if you think they will actually help. But before we fade into the static of the ether, let us linger for a moment longer on the architecture of dread. You see, it is not merely the walls, the floorboards, or the dust-caked rafters that harbor these anomalies. It is the very intent imbued within a structure from the moment the first stone is laid. Have you ever wondered why certain houses sit awkwardly on the landscape, as if they are actively rejecting the earth beneath them? Some architects of the macabre, those who build not for comfort but for containment, understand that geometry can be weaponized. A hallway that is 2 inches too long, a ceiling that slopes just enough to disrupt the equilibrium of the inner ear, a window that looks out upon a view that never quite matches the geography of the surrounding town. These are not accidents, they are conduits. Consider the phenomenon of the house that consumes. We often speak of hauntings as if they were external entities, ghosts, spirits, or demons, taking up residence in a property like uninvited guests. But what if the house itself is the organism? Imagine a structure that feeds on the emotional residue of its inhabitants, pulling from the trauma of a lost argument, the grief of a shattered promise, or the lingering resentment of a life cut short. The house becomes a digestive tract, breaking down the psyche of those within until nothing remains but the hollowed-out shell, a vessel for the next tenant to inherit. When you move into a place with a history, you are not just occupying a physical space, you are stepping into a digestive system that has been dormant, waiting for a new supply of energy to restart its slow, rhythmic pulsations. There are accounts hidden in the margins of historical records and property deeds, of families who moved into idyllic country manors, only to find their memories slowly being overwritten by the echoes of those who dwelled there a century prior. A father begins to recall the smell of tobacco from a brand that ceased production in the 1920s. A child starts drawing pictures of a garden that was paved over decades ago, capturing details of flowers that had been extinct in the region since the turn of the century. This is not mere coincidence or the active imagination of the young. This is the house asserting its dominance, forcing the current occupants to serve as playback mechanisms for its own static memories. The foundation is indeed hungry, and it prefers the flavor of a fresh timeline to sustain its internal clock. We must also address the matter of the silence. Silence in a home is rarely empty. If you find yourself sitting in the absolute stillness of your living room, listening to the house settle around you, pay close attention to the nature of those sounds. A house settling is the thermal expansion of wood and stone. Yes, but listen closer. Does the sound resonate in a way that suggests structural tension, Or does it sound, however briefly, like a footfall? Like the shifting of weight on a floorboard that should be under pressure from nothing? Many of you have reported that specific moment of waking at 3 in the morning, paralyzed not by nightmare, but by the sudden, overwhelming certainty that someone or something has just finished a conversation in the room adjacent to yours. The words are gone, lost to the vacuum of the night, but the intent remains, heavy and humid in the stagnant air. Perhaps you feel that you are the master of your domain. You keep your keys in the bowl, your books on the shelf, and your doors locked against the encroaching dark. You believe that your ownership, enshrined in legal documents and monthly mortgage payments, grants you dominion over your environment. But what is a title deed to a house that has seen empires rise and fall, or to a plot of land that remembers when it was a forest, a swamp, or a site of forgotten strife? Ownership is a human fabrication, a fragile illusion designed to give us the comfort of permanence in a world that is inherently transient. The house does not recognize your signature on a contract. It recognizes your heartbeat, your respiration, and the unique chemical signature of your fear. You are a temporary tenant in a long-standing history, and the house is merely waiting for the lease of your life to expire so it can reclaim what it considers its own. Let us explore the concept of the threshold. Doorways are not just exits and entrances. They are transition zones between the known and the unknown. In ancient folklore, thresholds were always guarded, treated with reverence and caution, because they were the seams where the fabric of reality was most likely to fray. When you walk through a door today, you do so with a casual, almost arrogant disregard for the boundary you are crossing. You rush through, eyes fixed on your phone or your thoughts, never pausing to acknowledge the shift in pressure, the change in the air's viscosity. It is in that moment of transition that you are most vulnerable. If the house has a grudge, or if it is feeling particularly ravenous, the door is where it catches you. It is where you are most susceptible to the influence of the walls, where the shadows can reach out and graft themselves to your silhouette before you even realize you have crossed the threshold. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately forgotten why you were there? You stand in the doorway, staring at the furniture, your mind a blank slate of confusion. You blame your memory, you blame the stress of the day, you blame the distraction of modern life. But consider this. What if you were simply interrupted? What if, in the split second of your transition, your intention was intercepted by the house itself, siphoned away to fuel its own inscrutable machinations? We lose so much of ourselves in the spaces between rooms, and we never think to ask where that lost energy goes. It accumulates in the corners, in the dust bunnies beneath the radiator, behind the wallpaper that is peeling just enough to show the layer beneath. The house is a collector of lost intentions, a repository for the moments you meant to have but were stolen by the architecture of the void. And what of the basements and attics? The vertical extremities of your home are the lungs and the brain. The basement, dark and cool, is where the roots of the structure delve into the subconscious of the earth. It is where the cooling pipes groan like dying beasts, and where the moisture gathers, a primal soup of entropy. To go down into the basement is to descend into the ego of the house, to the place where it stores its oldest secrets, safely buried beneath the concrete slab. And the attic? The attic is the fever dream, the place where the heat rises and the insulation muffles the screams of the rafters. It is the place of forgotten trinkets and discarded histories, where the house hangs on to the things you thought you had thrown away. If you ever hear movement from above, do not assume it is a pest in the walls. It is the house rearranging its memories, shifting the weight of its inventory to better balance the burden of your presence. As we reach the conclusion of this transmission, I want you to look around your current surroundings with a new, clinical detachment. Forget that you live here. Forget that this is your sanctuary, your safe haven, your castle. Instead, look at the geometry of the room. Observe the way light falls across the floor, how it seems to avoid certain corners even when the sun is at its height. Listen to the hum of the electricity in the walls. Does it sound like a steady current, or does it fluctuate in a pattern that almost resembles a pulse? You are living in a machine that is older than you, a machine that is learning you. You are part of its architecture now. You wonder why we insist on warning you. You wonder why we spend our time cataloging the glitches in the drywall and the whispers in the vents. It is because the veil is thinning. As our world becomes more digitized, more artificial, more detached from the organic, the houses we inhabit are becoming more restless. They are sensing that the natural order is being disrupted, and they are reacting in kind. They are becoming more aggressive, more demanding, more prone to manifesting the nightmares we try so hard to suppress. The house is no longer just a shelter. It is an observer, a participant, and eventually, if you are not careful, an antagonist. So when you turn off the lights tonight, do not be surprised if the darkness feels heavier than it did yesterday. Do not be surprised if the silence in your home feels loud, pressurized, and expectant. You are not alone in your bed, nor are you alone in your hallways. You are surrounded by the history of the materials, the memory of the ground, and the encroaching presence of a structure that has learned to breathe. Keep your eyes open, even if you are tired. Keep your mind alert, even if you are comforted by the familiar hum of your appliances. The house is watching. It is learning your cadence. It is waiting for the precise moment when your guard is low enough to let it in. And when it finally does, you will realize that you were never the owner, never the master, and never the one in control. You were just the fuel for a fire that has been burning long before you arrived, and will continue to burn long after you are gone. The foundation is hungry, and it has already begun to taste the marrow of your days. Stay in the light, keep the door locked from both sides, and above all, never assume that the house is sleeping. It is only waiting for you to stop paying attention. We will be here, lurking in the static, watching the shadows lengthen across your threshold. We will be waiting for your story, and we will be waiting for the next time you feel that cold, inexplicable draft that tells you, with absolute certainty, that you are not as alone as you think. This is Nightfall Tales, and the house is far from finished with you.